the theories of language acquisition. We are going to look at the theories of language acquisition. So we say that theories are the principles upon which the activities of something is based upon. So that is basically what theories are, or what theory is. So we want to look at some two examples of theories and their possible examples. So the first type of theory is what is known as the behaviorist theory of language acquisition. So what is behaviorist theory? The behaviorist theory, according to B.F. Skinner, states that children acquire language through habit formation, such as imitating or mimicking. So that is what the behaviorist theory means. Now let's look at some 4 examples of the behaviorist theory of language acquisition. One of them is what is known as imitating. Now what is imitating? Imitating is simply the act of repeating what is being heard. So what it means is that children can acquire language, or a child can acquire language by repeating or imitating what they hear from adults, such as caregivers or parents. So that is what is meant by imitating. And we are saying that children, or a child, acquires language by imitating others. And when children acquire language by imitating others, they form a habit. And that is why it is an example of the behaviorist theory of language acquisition. Now let's look at another example of the behaviorist theory of language acquisition. Another example is known as drills and repetition. Drills and repetition is another example of the behaviorist theory of language acquisition. Now, what is drills and repetition? Drills and repetition is very simple. It means that children constantly repeat what they hear around them, and they do that until they form a habit and master in the language that they repeat. So that is what is basically the drills and repetition means. Now the slight difference between the imitating and the drills and repetition is very simple. The imitation, the child instantly copies or repeats what he hears around him or her. But the drills and repetition is when the child continuously repeats whatever he or she hears until he masters that language. That is drills and repetition. And we say that it is an example of the behaviorist theory of language acquisition, because when children continuously repeat what they hear around them, they form a habit of language acquisition. So let's look at the third example of the behaviorist theory of language acquisition. The third example is what is known as trial and error. Now my marker is misbehaving. I would have been writing, but my marker is misbehaving. So another example of the behaviorist theory, as I said earlier, is trial and error. Now what is trial and error? Trial and error is very simple. It's a situation where a child tries to copy a language. Now, in the process of trying to copy the language, he fails and made mistake. And so when that happens, the adults or the caretakers or the caregiver or siblings or even parents around them, they correct them, and when they correct them, the child picks up the right language or word. And so that is why it is trial and error. They try to copy a language or a word, and then they fail, and they are then corrected by adults around them. And we say that it is an example of the behaviorist theory of language acquisition. The fourth example, let's look at the fourth example of the behaviorist theory of language acquisition. The fourth example is what is known as reinforcement. Reinforcement. Now, what is reinforcement? Reinforcement is in two categories. It's in positive and it's in negative. What it means is that a child might try to pronounce a word wrongly, and a child can also pronounce a word correctly. So we are saying that when the child pronounces a word correctly, he or she is being praised for pronouncing the word correctly. And so he is being praised in the form of little gifts and praises, and that motivates the child to continue the language or that word that he got correct, he pronounced correctly. Now, a child can also pronounce a word wrongly. When that happens, the caretaker or the parents or siblings or an adult around the child can correct the child, even punish the child for pronouncing a word wrongly, until the child repeats the correct word and acquired that language. That is what it means by reinforcement. So reinforcement can be in two categories. All right. So those are the four types or four examples of the behaviorist theory by B.F. Skinner, behaviorist theory of language acquisition. We said the first one is imitating and mimicking. The second one is trial and error. The third one is reinforcement. Yes. So, let's look at another type of theory of language acquisition, which is known as the cognitivism or the cognitivist theory of language acquisition. Now, what do we know or what do we understand by the cognitivist theory of language acquisition? Now, the word cognitivist comes from the word cognitive. So when we say cognitivist theory of language acquisition, all that we mean is that it's a mental framework that focuses on the internal mental process, viewing learners as active processors who perceives information, process information, and they have the capability to store that information and retrieve it for future reference or for future use. So basically that is what we meant by the cognitivist theory of language acquisition. So let's try to look at some few examples of the cognitivist theory of language acquisition. The first example of the cognitivist theory of language acquisition is what is known as schema development. Schema development. Now, what is schema development? Schema development is a continuous mental development, right? A continuous mental development that starts with the basic play in childhood and evolves into adulthood. I'm sure you understand that. Schema development is a continuous mental development that begins with the basic play in childhood and evolves into adult complexities of needs. Let's look at another example of the cognitivist theory of language acquisition, which is known as mental processes or mental processing. Now, what is mental processing? Mental processing states that learners or children have the ability to perceive information, process it, store it, and they also have the capability to retrieve that information for future use. So that is mental processing. And it's an example or one of the examples of the cognitivism theory of language acquisition. Now let's look at the third example of the cognitivist theory of language acquisition, which is known as active learning. Active learning. What is active learning? Now, active learning views learners as active processors of language and not just imitating or repeating others. And it's one of the examples of the cognitivist theory of language acquisition. So our fourth example of the cognitivist theory of language acquisition is what is known as hypothesis or overgeneralization. Now, what is hypothesis or what are hypotheses? Now, hypothesis is about making an educative guess about the principles of something, or making an educative guess about something. So, for example, when you ask a child the past tense of go, now the child doesn't know the past tense of go, so instead of the right answer, which is went, as we all know as the past tense of go, the child gave an answer and said the past tense of go is gold, as in adding ed to the word go. Now we said it's a hypothesis because the child is able to generate his or her own answer, which is not necessarily correct, but needed further investigations and approvals to be correct. So, and that is why we said it is an example of the cognitivist theory of language acquisition. There are many more theories of language acquisition, but we are going to end it here for now, and we shall continue later.